US President Donald Trump sanctions Russia's two biggest oil companies after scrapping a summit with President Vladimir Putin on the Ukraine war. New EU measures too, targeting Russian oil and assets. Will they bring an end to the war any closer? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. Perhaps the one thing certain about US President Donald Trump is his unpredictability. And in the past week, it's certainly been to the fore in efforts to end the war in Ukraine. Less than a week ago, a meeting with Ukraine's president at the White House reportedly ended in a shouting match. Trump had apparently demanded Volodymyr Zelenskyy agree to Russia's terms to end the war. That was after he announced a summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Budapest. Just days later, Trump cancelled that meeting and announced new sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil firms. Europe has also imposed further sanctions. All sides in the war acknowledge the US president's role is critical. But what can we make of the to and fro in the past few days? Is the conflict any nearer to an end, or is Trump frustrated with a lack of progress? We'll discuss this with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Alexandra Byers.
More than 3.5 years of war, and nights in the Ukrainian capital still aren't safe. Survivors are still waking up to the aftermath of Russian drone attacks and trying to pick up the pieces. There are similar scenes in Russia, with many wondering how many more days like this. In a surprise move on Wednesday, US President Donald Trump announced new sanctions on Russian oil producers Rosneft and Lukoil.
They're massive sanctions. It's sanctions on oil. The two biggest oil companies, among the biggest in the world, but they're Russian. They do a lot of oil. And hopefully it'll push, hopefully he'll become reasonable, and hopefully Zelenskyy will be reasonable too. You know, it takes two to tango.
Trump had spoken to President Vladimir Putin last week and said they'd agreed to meet in Hungary soon to try to end the war. But just as preparations began, the summit was called off.
When we canceled the meeting with President Putin, it didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like we were going to get to the place we have to get.
The US president is proposing a ceasefire that halts the fighting on the current front lines and allows for further negotiations after that. It's got the support of President Vladimir Zelenskyy, but Russia wants Ukraine to concede territory and has condemned the latest US sanctions.
We view this step as extremely counterproductive. It sends a bad signal in terms of reaching significant negotiation progress on a Ukrainian conflict settlement.
Pressure continues from Europe, too. The EU has brought forward a ban on Russian liquefied natural gas by a year, to begin in 2027. It's also blacklisted more tankers used to bypass restrictions on oil exports. And EU leaders have been exploring ways of using frozen Russian assets to help fund a loan for Ukraine's defense and reconstruction. Kyiv says the funds are critical and needed by the end of the year. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
OK, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Anatol Lieven, the director of the Eurasia programme at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Stephen Erlanger is the chief diplomatic correspondent for Europe at the New York Times. He joins us from Berlin. And Chris Weafer is the CEO of Macro-Advisory, a strategic consultancy focused on Russia and Eurasia. He joins us from London. A warm welcome to all of you. I'll start with you, Anatol, in Washington. Do you think these latest sanctions will be enough to bring the Kremlin to the table to agree to what Trump says he hopes will be an immediate ceasefire?
No, I very much doubt it. I was in Russia earlier this month, and very nearly everybody I talked to said that Putin is completely nailed to getting the whole of the Donbass. Ukraine still holds about 30% of Donetsk province. Putin has given up the demand that as part of a ceasefire, Ukraine withdraw from two other provinces, Zaporizhia and Kherson. But at the start of the war, he declared that a key goal was, as Russia calls it, the liberation of the whole of the Donbass. He promised that to the local governments in the Donbass, who, by the way, provide a quite disproportionate share of the Russian troops fighting in Ukraine. And everybody said that for Putin to give up that demand would be politically impossible. And another reason for that is that, as most Russians are aware, and Putin must be aware himself, the way that this war was launched was a disaster for Russia, and a disaster with Putin in the end bears responsibility. That makes it even more difficult for him to accept a peace settlement that does not look like a Russian victory.
Stephen, do you share Anatol's pessimism?
Unfortunately, I do. And even if Putin does decide in the end that the economic pressure down the road is too strong, it wouldn't be soon, because it would simply look like weakness in the face of Donald Trump finally doing something. I don't think, these sanctions, even on these two big oil companies, would have a big immediate effect. I mean, they obviously will have an effect if other countries in the world respect these sanctions, and if the Americans do use their secondary sanctions, like the banning of using the dollar and American banks and so on for these companies. But I do agree with Anatol that Putin's rule now and his reputation and his legacy depends on not losing in Ukraine. And that means not giving in to blandishments or pressure from Washington, Brussels, or anywhere else.
Chris, Trump says these are tremendous sanctions. Do you share our other guests' pessimism, or do you think they might work this time?
Well, I think they make a difference. In themselves, they certainly will make life more difficult for Russia. They will definitely lead to a reduction in oil receipts. There's no question of that. But on their own, they're not big game changers. I guess in Moscow today, the narrative is about the fact that President Trump has actually moved to put in place sanctions for the first time in his current presidency. So the fear or the conversation in Moscow is that he could now follow through, that if he doesn't see the sort of progress that he wants to see or he expects, then much more damaging sanctions could follow relatively quickly. But the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, even though they sound very damaging, they're not as significant as the headlines. For example, a lot of Russian oil is sold through intermediaries. A lot of Russian oil is sold as like blended Russian oil. And we know that there has been kind of quite a number of mechanisms put in place since 2023, when the EU banned Russian oil to kind of, if you like, to work around sanctions. And I would remind you that there has been very, very significant sanctions on anybody buying Iranian oil for quite some time. But yet we know from traders that Iran is currently exporting equivalent of about 1.7 million barrels of oil a day and selling it and getting paid for it. So it's not these sanctions, but it's the fact that he stepped over the line, and more damaging sanctions could come down the line if he's not satisfied with progress.
Anatol, taking into account what you said about how disastrous this war really has been for Putin and for Russia, didn't you feel that the Russians, Putin, is looking for some sort of out by the fact that they were going to have this meeting in Budapest? So the Russians are ready to talk and maybe not being as absolutist in their demands as they might previously have been.
Oh, no, the Russians are definitely willing to talk. And, they are looking for, concrete proposals from the Trump administration on wider issues of European security. The problem is that this atrocious issue of 30% of Donetsk and a few small half-ruined towns, that is the sticking point, the biggest sticking point. There are some others, but I think that frankly, either if Russia can conquer the whole of the Donbass, or just possibly if it could be neutralized under a UN peacekeeping force, I do think that the other issues could actually be solved. It's not true, I think, anymore that Russia is pursuing its original goal of subjugating the whole of Ukraine or annexing huge amounts of new territory from Ukraine, because it's simply at the moment not militarily possible. As we have all learned, contemporary military technology gives huge advantages to the defensive. And just as, by the way, Ukraine can't reconquer its lost territory unless there is some really unexpected Russian breakthrough. The Russians, cannot pursue their maximalist program, and therefore they are willing to talk. It's just a question of what they're willing to talk about.
Okay, well, Stephen, do you sense a willingness for Russia to budge from its absolutist positions, i.e., not being given control of the whole of the Donbass, freezing lines where they are at the moment? Have you sensed any movement there?
Well, publicly, none. I mean, this is one reason why the Budapest meeting was called off, because when Secretary of State Rubio talked to Foreign Minister Lavrov, Lavrov said, our position hasn't changed a bit. And Rubio went to Trump and said, there's no point having a meeting because we're back to where we were, which is this demand that Ukraine give up, what would be roughly 2% of its entire territory, which is roughly twice as much as Russia's been able to win on the ground in the last 18 months or so. So if Russia wants to take the rest of the Donbass by force, it may take them quite a long time, which is why I still think Putin sees Donald Trump as his best instrument for a favorable conclusion to the war. Don't forget also, Lavrov, whether he's speaking for himself or not, one isn't sure, but Lavrov keeps talking about we can't let the rest of Ukraine be run by Nazis, he just said. Yeah. And they still want, as Anatol suggested, a larger security architecture discussion for Europe, which was part of their original plan. They, basically Putin wants to do a deal with Trump. Trump wants to do a deal with Putin. Ukraine's in the way, but Ukraine's being very stubborn and is refusing to surrender.
Sure. Chris, we've got 30 days before these sanctions actually take effect. Is that a deliberately built into for what the White House might allow for negotiations before then to give room for manoeuvre?
Well, it does. It does create a window, of course, for discussions. But U.S. sanctions always come with a 30-day grace period to allow counterparties and companies involved with those being sanctioned to make adjustments. So the 30 days is normal for the US. But nevertheless, we have heard from President Trump yesterday kind of highlighting the 30 days, specifically saying that if there is progress or if he's satisfied with progress, then these sanctions will come off quickly. And we heard later informally that he could even delay the sanctions, the implementation of sanctions by even another 30 days if he is satisfied that there is some momentum or some progress. But I want to just wheel back. I think it is actually important in discussions we have in Moscow. And, if you look only at the headlines, of course, one would not be anything other than extremely pessimistic about any progress. But when you talk to people informally and you listen to some people, the picture is somewhat, certainly a lot more nuanced. I don't think that the Russians are as hung up on territory as they were when the war started. In other words, we want this particular geography and this is the objective. I think we moved away from that. There certainly, it clearly is a requirement of some sort of a new kind of security architecture or a new arrangement with NATO or with the West. I think that's much more of a core issue. Russia has always talked about the expansion of NATO up to its western border, threatening its security, etc. So I think what it's really looking for is some new solid agreement with NATO and Washington, which kind of addresses that security concern. I don't think it's about, particular landmass anymore. The impression I get is that the Russians are relatively happy with what they've got if they then get this kind of newer security arrangement with the West, which makes them feel more secure on their western borders. I think that's the core issue for Putin, rather than specifics of geography or of holdings.
Anatol, you're nodding away there. Do you sense that, I beg your pardon, do you sense then that if NATO is willing to freeze where it is at the moment, to stop any further expansion, to not allow Ukraine into NATO, do you think that will appease the Russians?
Well, I mean, that is certainly going to have to be a key part of any settlement. Yeah. But by the way, an agreement of that kind would have to freeze not just NATO expansion, but also the expansion of the Russian-dominated Collective Security Treaty Organization. So it would have to be a mutual freeze. One can imagine other things, America, for example, limiting its forces in countries on Russia's borders in return for limits on Russian forces in Belarus, for example. There are lots of things that can be agreed, I think, without, badly damaging Western interests. But firstly, the Trump administration has to actually put these forward. Oh. Secondly, I was told that no, that would not, that the demand for the whole of the Donbass is still absolute, but not places far beyond, but the Donbass, yes. But finally, you see, there is a problem, which is that any agreement made by Trump can be torn up by the Democrats if they win the US elections in 2028, just as Trump tore up so many agreements made by his predecessor, Obama. So the Russians would want something pretty solid from not just America, but NATO, perhaps Ukraine. And that is... Trump can say all these things, but how can he guarantee that the Russians that America will keep its word in future? Because just as the West doesn't trust Russia an inch anymore, Russia, of course, also doesn't trust us.
All right, Stephen, we haven't just got US sanctions. The EU is tightening its sanctions. We'll stop importing Russian LNG by the end of 2027. We've had India's major private oil refiner saying it's going to stop taking in Russian oil. So the noose is tightening somewhat, isn't it, over Russia, or can it still ride this out?
Well, I think it's been a good couple of days for Europe and its commitment to support Ukraine. I mean, it has gotten Trump off the Putin narrative, at least for now. It has gotten the Americans to get some sanctions on Russia. It has produced a 19th sanctions package. It is moving toward using 220 billion euros in frozen Russian assets for a loan to support Ukraine, which will help European governments because they don't have a lot of budget space in their own budgets. So I think it's been a pretty good couple days, and the direction of travel is to squeeze Russia. Just to make one comment about what Anatol said, of course, what he said is true, but it doesn't take a change of president in America to rip things up. Putin was president of Russia when he agreed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, and he's ripped it up all by himself.
All right. Chris, if you couple the EU sanctions with those imposed by the US, with India, India's major oil refiner not refining Russian oil anymore. Is that tightening the noose around Russia's economy?
Look, the noose is definitely getting tighter. You cannot assume otherwise. There's now almost 30,000 separate sanctions in place against Russia. So it's definitely making life more difficult. It depends on workarounds. We were in a situation quite similar, I guess, at the end of 2022, coming into 23, when the EU banned the import of oil from Russia. The price cap was put in place, and other banking transaction sanctions put in place. And it led to a very difficult 6 months period for Russia, where the budget revenues went down, the budget deficit went up. But by the summer of 2023, workarounds had already been put in place. Volumes picked up and the discounts went down. So it would be naive to assume that exactly the same thing will happen again. But workarounds are possible. And what companies say, for example, the Indian refiners, what they have said many times in the past, that they're not doing something only to end up actually being found out later that they did find some other way to do it. So in other words, it's yet to be seen. There is no doubt that Russia, if these sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil do actually come into place at the end of November, then Russia faces a difficult first quarter in terms of export receipts, that's for sure, as coupled with the EU sanctions that have been applied today. But, again, Russia has been declared dead economically several times over the last 3 years because of sanctions, and has managed to survive and work around. We wait to see. It is getting more difficult, though, because there are fewer loopholes and there are fewer options. But I think it's still too early to call, kind of a crisis in the Russian economy or the Russian budget. We're not there yet, but it is getting tougher.
OK. Anatol, just quickly, also your view on the cumulative effect of the sanctions from the US, from the European Union and other countries outside that being affected by it. Does it tighten the noose?
It certainly tightens the noose. And, the Russian economy is in growing trouble. But I don't think it will bring Putin to surrender to US terms unless, as I say, a real compromise is offered by Trump. There is also, one must say, the risk that if the noose really does tighten and the Russia's ability to continue the war is affected, that Russia will seek to escalate drastically in some way, or will retaliate drastically to any Western escalation.
All right. Stephen, we touched on it at the beginning of the programme, but domestically, what can Vladimir Putin get away with in negotiations with the elite in Russia, with the Russian population? Can he get away with a deal that freezes the conflict on current lines? Can he get away with a NATO commitment to not expand further and for the Russian equivalent not to do the same?
I think he can. I mean, there's a very sophisticated propaganda organization, which we all know. It works pretty well in Western Europe, too. I think in terms of the populace, people sort of think there's the king and then there's us, and the king is the king and we'll live with it. The elite is obviously feeling squeezed, the business elite. But so far, Putin's been very good at kind of putting the nooses around their necks. So I think he's okay. It's always hard to know. When you had the old system and you had a Politburo, there was a structure set up to remove the sort of general secretary. There's no such structure now in Russia. So I think he's okay. But I agree with Anatol that if things get really dire, we may be back to the issue of tactical nuclear weapons. This is what actually worries me.
All right. Chris, does your analysis lead you to any understanding of what domestically Putin can get away with in any negotiations?
First of all, the economy is not in trouble. It's not facing a crisis. the country is not about to run out of money. The level of growth has come down for sure. A lot of that is by deliberate monetary policy rather than the effects of sanctions, and it's quite stable. Unemployment's 2.5%, real wage growth, inflation has passed the peak, interest rates coming down. So for ordinary people, life is relatively normal. Of course, they can't travel and there's some other restrictions, but life is quite normal. There's no sense that they're getting angry against the Kremlin or the president. As far as I can see, everything is okay. And also, there's a big misconception, I think, in the West, about the Russian elite that squeeze the oligarchs, squeeze the billionaires, and they'll put pressure on the Kremlin. Those days are well gone. That was the case under President Yeltsin, but it absolutely is not the case today. Okay. Billionaires, oligarchs have got zero political influence. In other words, they can no longer be called oligarchs in that sense. They've got no influence on government policy whatsoever. As far as I can see, President Putin, so long as he doesn't make a misstep, so long as he doesn't lose, then I think he's safe. And right now, I don't see any pressure building on him whatsoever.
Anatol, should we be wary, Stephen touched on it, of the consequences of the risk of escalation? Should NATO, in a way, how NATO might respond to Russian infractions of airspace, for example? Is there a risk that we've got to be very careful where we go from now?
Absolutely, because given the extreme slowness of Russian advance on the ground, given the pressure that he is under from hardliners within the Russian establishment, it's the hardliners, the hardline nationalists who are the threat to Putin, not, as Chris has said, the business elites or whatever. I don't think that Putin will escalate. He has always, off his own bat. He has threatened, but he has always resisted this. But I was told by, once again, just about everybody, if NATO shoots down a Russian aircraft that enters NATO airspace, Russia will shoot down NATO aircraft in response. If NATO seizes ships with Russian cargoes on the high seas, Russia will either convoy those ships or will attempt to sink the NATO vessels that intercept those ships. And then, of course, you can see escalation towards full-scale war. So I think, yes, economic sanctions are one thing. As Chris has said, Russia can ride those out. But escalation in military terms from the West would be hideously dangerous.
All right, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there for the moment. But thanks to our guests, Anatol Lieven, Stephen Erlanger and Chris Weafer. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here, bye for now.